Let's go ahead and review quickly what we said in the first session at the top of page 14. So the providence, foreknowledge, provision, and prognosis of God all reveal that He knows everything in advance, and He's working everything out for His own purposes and will. And this is the main message of Esther to us, the Christian believer. God's name might be absent, but His actions are present. The invisible God is visible by His power and His workings. We also saw that the Persian Empire and its kings were a very important part of biblical and world history, especially in the stories of Ezra, Nehemiah, Daniel, Haggai, Zechariah, and Esther. If you take any courses, you go to college, you go to university, and even online, I took a lot of courses, reading courses and video courses on the Persian Empire. They're always talking about the battles, the Persian battles, the Peloponnesian War, the battles between the Greeks and the Persians. So this is very, hashed out in the universities, all that happened between these two massive empires, the Greeks and the Persian Empire. So we saw that the chest and the arms of silver, the devouring bear from the sea, and the ram with the two horns were all prophesied as a coming kingdom that would dominate the whole world. And that's one thing we have to note, is that the Persian Empire was a world empire. It dominated the whole world. It was a very powerful empire. So the book of Esther is filled with many plots, twists, ironies, ups and downs. There are many strange foreign names, months, and dates. There are many feasts, there's many decrees, and there's many hangings. Even the two guys that plotted to assassinate the king, they were hung. The 3rd, 7th, and 12th years are critical for understanding the story of Esther, and they're found consecutively there in chapters 1, 2, and 3. So let's start by reading here. And in this first session, we're going to cover whole sections of verses. But we're going to cover chapters 1 and 2. And let's read here again from chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. And the title of tonight's message, of course, is we're going to go from Queen Vashti to Queen Esther. So from Vashti to Esther, all fulfilling God's purposes way in advance before Haman shows up. So can you see that already? Chapter 1 was in the 3rd year of this king. Haman shows up 9 years later in the 12th year. So God is already maneuvering Esther 9 to 10 years before Haman ever comes. He's already got Esther in place because God already knows Haman's going to come and try to annihilate all the Jews. So he's already moving Esther into place. And actually Mordecai also in chapter 2, he moves him into place as well. All right, let's read here. Chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Now it came to pass in the days of King Ahasuerus. This was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, you might have a translation that says Susa, the citadel, the fortress, that in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media. Notice, when Media was in power, the Bible usually writes it as Media Persia. But here, because the Persians are in power, it lists them first. And you'll see that in the first chapter especially. Powers of Persia and Media. The nobles and the princes and the provinces being before him. When he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. Wow, 6 months of partying. That's what they did. That was a long time. And some people question whether that was historically accurate, that somebody could actually do that, especially a king that had such a large military and needed a lot of manpower and resources, that he could have it for that long. But it's true, the Bible's true, so I believe it. So the events of chapter 1 really set the stage for the rest of the book. What you see in chapter 1, you're going to just see repeated over and over and over again. You're going to see a king get angry, you're going to see decrees, you're going to see all these things over and over again in Esther. So what happens in chapter 1 kind of sets it up for what happens in the rest of the book. We also want to note, because of the size of his empire, you can see there are 127 provinces that went all the way from India, which would be modern-day Pakistan, all the way down to Ethiopia, which would be modern-day Sudan. That it's such a massive empire that from Shushan, from Susa, it would take these Pony Express, these horses, it could take them a long, long time. We're not told how long it took them, but to travel perhaps 2,000 miles on horses, that would take quite a while to do all of that. And so it was very far. They went swiftly, but it was far. Right away in this story, we see in verse 3, it says, in the 3rd year of his reign. We know this year from historical sources, we know when that is. It was 483 BC. Herodotus, the Greek historian, the father of history, some call him the father of lies because he had so much information that was wrong. But we know that date accurately, that's when that happened. Now, here's the background to why was he throwing this party and this feast for all these officials, all these servants, all these nobles, all these princes. He was bringing them in, all 127 from all these places. He was bringing them in, perhaps in groups, or maybe he was bringing them in all at one time. So he's got this massive group of people there. Well, the history behind it we know. We know it well. His father, King Darius, led the first war, Persian war, against the Greeks. And it was a very famous battle. You can read about it online. It's on videos and all that. Universities teach on it. It was the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. And Darius came with a superior Persian army and fought against the Greeks, and he was soundly defeated by the Greeks. And at the end of that battle, there was a man, he has a really long name, about this long, I'm trying to pronounce it right now, but he ran from the city of Marathon, at the Battle of Marathon, he ran all the way to Athens, and he ran 26.23 miles from Marathon to Athens. And that's where we get the marathon, that's where we get the distance for a marathon event is 26.25 miles. So this guy ran to tell all the Athenians in Athens that they had beaten the Persians. And after he said that, he dropped dead. That's the story, that he dropped dead. Some people say it was myth. Other people say it was a true story. So we don't know. God knows what happened. But so Darius now dies in 486 BC. We know that. Historically, we know that happened. And so his son, this guy here, Xerxes Ahasuerus, takes over. So he's got to go back and undo and go back and win a battle against these Greeks. So what he's doing, and historians have told us, including Herodotus, told us that what he was doing was he was drumming up support. He's trying to rally the troops. He's bringing everybody in. He's throwing these big, lavish parties because he's trying to get everybody to support him in another war that he's going to fight in a couple of years. He's going to fight this war against the battles against the Greeks. And so he brings in all these military leaders for 6 months. He holds this feast. And then right after that, in chapter 5, he holds another feast that only lasts 7 days, but it's for all the soldiers and the commoners that were there in the capital. So he's trying to keep everything positive. He's running to drum up support for this coming battle. He wants to keep everybody happy with lots of food, wine, and song. He needs everybody behind him because he's getting ready to go fight this next battle against the Greeks, which we know happened in 480. So everybody needs to be behind the king and what he's doing. It's a big party to try to get everybody to back the king up. And today people do that even in our political scene, where they try to get everybody to support the king. Everything needs to be kept positive. So that's why the Vashti incident, that's what I call it, becomes such a disaster. Everybody is supposed to back up the king and support the king. And lo and behold, the very queen refuses to listen to what he says. So it's like a disaster of the worst kind. And we're going to get to it in just a minute, that she could do that. Like the balloon was getting really, really big, and Vashti came and just popped the whole balloon right there, right in front of him. Now, I need to tell you something about the Persian Empire. So often Christians, scholars, theologians, people all through the centuries have had problems with this book, and we try to impose our Christian morals on the book of Esther, and that's going to lead you into a lot of problems. You're going to get really angry at this king, because that's the way those kings operated back then. They had harems. They had concubines. Herodotus and other historians said that King Xerxes, this king right here, had 360 concubines. One for every day of the year. And so he could call any one of them that he wanted in to have sex with him. Bottom line, sex with him to please him for that night, and then back she goes. She may never be called again. But she had to stay, and then the next chapter we're going to see they had entire women's quarters, like a dorm. They had a dorm with people who were eunuchs that would take care of all these women that he had. And so we as Christians, men and women, Christians, we look at this in horror, and as we're going to say in a few minutes, like, yeah, Vashti, good for you. I'm glad you didn't give in to what he said. You know, we kind of come at it with that way. But the Persian culture, they weren't thinking that at all. Those people were there. They were horrified. These guys were horrified that somebody would dare disobey the king. And you just have to understand that kind of mentality. So it's hard for us today looking at this. We try to impose our Christian morals. But this was a Persian kingdom where a king issued stuff by decree. And whatever he wanted, he got. That's just the way it was. Eunuch. The word eunuch, it's a Greek word. Eune is the Greek word for bed. And ekkain, the last part of eunuch in Greek, is to be a keeper. And so a eunuch was someone who kept the bed for a king. So he was castrated so that he would not mess with any of the girls that belonged to the king. And so he was a guy. So as you read Esther, you're going to see eunuch. All these guys are eunuchs. Why? Because this guy had 360 plus or hundreds of beautiful women. And if you look at any of the pictures, I had to black out part of it here, sorry. You look at any of the paintings and pictures that are done about Persia, and you look at the harems and the concubines, you see that these women were walking around half nude. And they were there just partying up, waiting for the king to summon them. And you can imagine a guy being in the middle of that. It could turn into like, you get a Me Too movement right away, you know. But honestly, that's why they were eunuchs. I'm just telling you that. Haggai and Shaashgaz and Harbona, they're all eunuchs. Why are they all castrated? Because there was a lot of cute girls running around, and they had to be that way. I mean, I'm just giving you the honest, brutal truth. That's why this is written this way. So when you see Vashti being summoned by him, and he goes enraged because she won't respond, and many people look at this, good for you, Vashti, you stood up to that guy. It was a disaster for them. But I wanted you to see that this is the way it is. And we're going to see how horrible. I want to tell you, for us today as Christians, how horrible the Miss Persia beauty contest in the next chapter really is. For us, it's horrible. for the king, it was awesome to go through the whole empire and pick a really cute girl. But for us, it's horrifying. You go to the top of page 16. So everything is royal, right? You see the splendor here. Royal wine, royal palace, royal crown, royal decree, royal position. And even the words kingdom are all the same Hebrew word. This is the adjective, the Hebrew for kingdom is the noun. Everything's royal. And you look at all the riches. It says glorious kingdom, splendor, excellent majesty, abundance, generosity. And you see how awesome the palace is there. You see marble pillars, gold and silver, fine linen, mosaic pavement, golden vessels, white and black marble, just awesome. I was thinking Roberta would have loved to live there and just decorate that whole. She would have just decorated. It would have been like, thank you, Jesus, you're just right there in decorating all of this. But you just get this person who just has vast amounts of wealth, and they're just wealthy, rich. The rich and famous are right here. So you need to tie these words together. In verse 4, what does it say? He showed them. It was to show off. He's showing them the riches and the splendor of His majesty. And so what do you read in verse 11? He wants to show her beauty to everybody. So he was showing all this splendor. Now he wants to show off this woman that was his queen. He wants to show her off. And it also wants to remind you in verse 9 that even the royal palace that Queen Vashti is using to host this woman's feast, it belongs to King Ahasuerus. So just because she's having this feast, don't forget, the king owns that palace. And it says that right there, right, in verse 9. In the royal palace which belonged to King Ahasuerus. So don't forget that. That's what the author is getting you to know. Like, Vashti's not on her own. She can't do whatever she wants. The king owns that place where she's having the party. So this is the last day of the feast, right? As you look there in verse 10, they've already had the 180-day feast. They've had the 7 days of feasting. This is the last day. So the king needs to pull out all the stops. What is the most prized, awesome, beautiful, inspiring possession that he owns? What's the ultimate thing that he can bring to impress his military officers, the nobles? Well, you guys know who it was. It was Vashti. She's the most beautiful woman. And he wants to bring her front and center. So, Vashti, it means best or beloved or the desired one. And so the ultimate rejection that this king could experience is now going to happen. It's her refusal. And again, for us today as Christians, as we try to impose our morals on this, Vashti becomes like a heroine. She's like, good for you, Vashti, you did good. But it was written in a much different culture and a realm where those kinds of things were not considered. So we need to see, and this was Pastor Rick was asking for right now, in verse 10 he commanded, verse 12 the king's command, verse 15 she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus, and King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti. So what she did to them, these Persians, was unthinkable. The ultimate treason. He could control 127 provinces, but he could not control the will of one woman. So how do these Persians react? Not only does the king react in anger, he is burning in anger, verse 12. So what do? We are the law-abiding citizens of Persia. So we do everything according to law. And you see that wording right in verse 8 when they're drinking. We do everything according to law. And you see it in verse 13. Let's bring in people that know the law. And then you go to verse 15. What should be done with Queen Vashti? Verse 15. According to the law. Queen Vashti didn't just offend the king. She violated the law here. And we got to deal with her according to this. And so you see that language happening. So there are these 7 advisors, these counselors in verse 14. And they have access into the king's presence. And as Job says, literally in Hebrew, that was an idiom that meant the 7 who see the face of the king. Because remember, not anybody is allowed into his presence, right? You had to be summoned. But these guys could go in uninvited and unannounced. They had access to the king, so they could just walk in and unannounced. And so I call him Mamukin the Mexican. He makes this out to be like, I mean, it was a hill. He made it into Mount Everest. I mean, he says, this offense. Notice the language that he uses here. All the princes, all the people, in all the provinces. It's going to be known by all the women and all the ladies everywhere. They're going to come and protest to the king's officials. This is what Vashti's done. I mean, this is going to affect everybody and everything. This is going to be a massive rebellion by the women, and we need to stop it right now. So he makes it be even worse. And it wasn't just like he says there in verse 16. She's not only wronged the king, but all the princes, all the people in all the provinces of our king. So you can see that they were really stirred up and riled by what Vashti's done. So Mamukin the Mexican, he's on a roll here. And he's not only going to discern what the problem is, he is going to make a recommendation as to Vashti's fate. And here's the beginning of all these decrees that we're going to see in the book of Esther. And then all of a sudden, from here on out, verse 17, where it said Queen Vashti, after that, you're not going to see Queen Vashti. You're going to just see, like in verse 19, Vashti. Queen got struck out right away from her title. And every other time Vashti shows up in the 2nd chapter, it always just mentions her as Vashti. She was stripped completely of her title, and she could no longer come into the king's presence, which was a really big deal. And this decree also made it so that the wives will have to honor their husbands, and each man should be the master of his own house. That was what the decree. Banish Vashti, raise up another queen, and everybody in the homes, the wives cannot rebel against their husbands. So, here's God's providence. Vashti has to be removed so that Esther can be placed. And in verse 19, we see that there, let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. And so already in advance, 9 years before Haman, God is already beginning his work to put in the person he wants to be next to the king, to deal with Haman's threat, which was really a genocide. It was the worst threat. It was worse than even Hitler, what Hitler was doing in Germany. As terrible as that was, this was worse because he was going to wipe out all the Jews in the whole world with that edict, the decree that he had. So Swindoll says, exit Vashti, enter Esther. So one goes out and the other one comes in. So now here in chapter 2, we have the beginning of the Miss Persia beauty pageant. Unfortunately, it was not just a pageant to see who was the most beautiful. It was also a pageant to see who was going to be queen. And you have to understand this whole selection process. They had to go, remember, they have to go thousands of miles to go get young girls from all these provinces and bring them back, the best looking ones, to there. They have to weed out who's who. They have to figure out if you were, in fact, if you were a Jew, you were automatically disqualified. They didn't even pick anybody that was from Judah because they didn't pick Jews. They were enslaved people that had gone to exile, so they didn't want Jewish people. So that's why Esther couldn't tell them her identity, because if she would have been disqualified right away. So this whole process takes 4 years, from the 3rd year to the 7th year. We know that because of verse 16, because that's when she takes her royal position, is in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, which is January, in the 7th year of his reign. So what happens? What happens during this time? Well, guess what? The king finally has amassed this large army. Herodotus, the Greek historian, says that he took more than 1,000,000-man army up against the Greeks. And he goes and fights these battles. Again, these are very famous battles. Historians and university classes, Thermopylae and Salamis. Salamis was a naval battle. They had superior ships, the Persians did. They were still defeated. Again, they were defeated. So the Persians defeated them. Even though they won that one battle at Thermopylae, they beat the Greeks. There was only 300 Spartan Greeks fought this massive army, and they were beating them. And in the end, they ended up killing all those 300 Spartans. And they said, we got a victory. Right after that, they fought this naval battle, Salamis, and the ships got destroyed. So remember, 483, he goes, fights this battle, 480, so he comes back. He comes back. And in that last year is when they have all these beauty treatments that they do on the finalists of the women of this Miss Persia beauty contest. And so that's now 479, the 7th year of Ahasuerus' reign. That's when he's now going to pick his queen. And this is where these two main characters, the Jewish characters, come in. Mordecai and Esther are now introduced for us in verses 5 and 6. So notice how Mordecai is introduced. A certain Jew. That's the way he's introduced. And that's going to be his identity all the way through, is his Jewishness. And that's when they asked him, how come you don't bow when Haman passes by? He gave them one answer. Right there in chapter 3, verse 4, he goes, because I'm a Jew. That's why. I'm not going to bow to anybody. I'm a Jew. I'm keeping the first commandment. I'm not bowing. And he was known, if you look at all those verses, 5:13, 6:10, 8:7, 9:29, 9:31, 10:3, he was known as Mordecai the Jew. And when Haman just absolutely despised him, he used that language on him. That Jew, Mordecai, I hate him. So here's a critical piece of information that allows you to see these two titanic things coming into battle here in the book of Esther. We're told where Mordecai comes from, who his forefathers are. And it turns out Mordecai happens to be in the family line with King Saul, who was the son of Kish, who was a Benjamite. All right, in 1 Samuel chapter 9. So it says that right there, right? He's the son of Kish, a Benjamite. So, who was King Saul? In 1 Samuel 15, what did God tell Samuel to do? To wipe out the Agag and the Amalekites. Right? So Mordecai, the Jew, his forefathers are descended of Saul, and so Saul did not obey God, and he failed to wipe out Agag and the Amalekites. Well, Samuel ended up killing Agag, but the Amalekites were not wiped out. And guess who Haman is? He's an Agagite. He's an Amalekite. So Mordecai, the descendant of Saul, comes with Haman, who's an Amalekite. So here we have the same issue that God tried to deal with Saul is happening again here in Persia. The Jew against the Amalekite. And as you study Exodus and Deuteronomy and what happened there with King Saul, God wanted to wipe out the Amalekites, and he wants to do it here again. And he's going to with a large part of Haman, and his family, of course, is wiping them out. But here's God's revenge also against the Amalekites. So we see these two titanic backgrounds coming together in Esther for this battle. And we see, verse 6, how did Mordecai, a Jew, how did he and his forefathers even get over into Persia? Well, we're told they were carried away when this king, Jeconiah of Judah, Babylonian, the Nebuchadnezzar, took him to Babylon, and then from Babylon, they ended up going to Persia when the Persians took over for the Babylonians. So that's how Mordecai ended up in Persia, was he was part of this exile. He and his forefathers that came before him, they were carried away by Nebuchadnezzar, and now they're over in Shushan in Persia, and so they're exiled. These are exiled people. These are slave people. These are people that are going to be servants. And they're now been exiled here into Persia. Right, so we also know that he was the father to Esther. Esther was an orphan. It happened to be her cousin. The uncle, Abihail, died. The mother died, so he ends up like adopting this orphan girl. And he becomes the one who nurses her. He's the one who raises her up. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. I like something Eugene Peterson said about Mordecai that I think is very strong. Because Mordecai is just a guy who's being a good old boy Jew. You know, he's just going to do what he needs to do to make sure everything works out. And Eugene Peterson says this: his leadership was an outgrowth of what he was. He did not set himself up to lead. He did not aspire to leadership. He was simply a Jew. By living consistently within that identity and doing the duties that went with it, he fulfilled the functions of leadership, raising his uncle's daughter, keeping the first commandment, interceding for his people, trusting in God. Leadership for Mordecai was not self-assertion nor ego fulfillment, but being a man of God and doing whatever flowed naturally from that traditional identity. I love that. And that's true of us today. We are Christians. We are ambassadors of Jesus Christ. We represent the King. And that's all. You may not have a title. You may not be a pastor, an evangelist, a prophet, or anything like that, or a deacon, or any other thing. But you are a Christian. And you are a follower of Jesus Christ. And you do whatever it takes to be obedient to God, to follow God, to serve the Lord, to worship, to evangelize, to minister, to pray, to do all those things. We do it out of our Christian identity. We don't need a title to serve the Lord. All we need to know is that we're an ambassador of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and we, out of that identity, we do whatever is necessary to serve the purposes of God. And that's what Mordecai was there to do. You don't see him with a title later on. You see him with a crown on his head. God did promote him. God did give him leadership. But he, in these early chapters, was just doing what he needed to do because he was Jewish and he was going to follow the Lord. Hadassah now, Esther comes on the scene. Hadassah is a Hebrew word that means myrtle, like the myrtle tree. And Esther, the Persian name, means star. And so she had to very carefully, and that's an awesome thing, she had to carefully balance living in these two worlds. We know her as Hadassah, a Jew, but the king and Haman, they didn't even know, up until we saw this video, they didn't even know that she was Jewish. She had to keep that kind of secret until the right time. And that was hard to do, you know, to keep it that way. But she was living as a Jewish person in a Persian court. That's hard to do. So let's consider God's providence here. Here's this orphan girl. Think about it. An orphan girl whose mother and father dies ends up being one of the most powerful people in the whole Persian Empire. That's God right there. But Esther needed Abihail, that was her father, for his looks. But he needed Mordecai for his brains and what Mordecai understood about the Persian culture. So even that detail was prearranged by God. So as the story unfolds, you see both her beauty and her wisdom shine. So, we say it even of our son who's adopted and other kids that are adopted. All those things, people can feel sorry for themselves. Why don't I have my parents? Why all this? It's all supernaturally arranged by God. God makes it. He has a reason why He set it up that way. And we don't need to feel sorry for ourselves. We need to see what God's plan is in it all. And so she was a very beautiful woman, very lovely to look at, of course. And that's the way it's worded in the Hebrew there, Baldwin says. But consider also this other incredible providence of God that I've already mentioned in a Sunday service, and I mentioned over there at the convention. Approximately 40 to 50 million people in the whole Persian Empire. And if half of those are women, so let's just take 50 million, 25 million are women, and then you eliminate all the children and the married women and the older women, and let's just say there was 50,000 eligible ladies, and out of those, let's just say only 10% of them were like really attractive women. So again, these numbers are not in the Bible, we're just using them to talk about this. There's all these attractive women, I'm sure they were by the thousands. Josephus, the Jewish historian, writing almost 2,000 years ago from his sources, say that the 400 women made the final cut of who was going to be the queen. So even then, Esther's competing. She has to hide her identity. And in the end, she gets selected out of all of those people. An orphan girl. What are the chances that that can happen? What are the chances when they really didn't pick anybody from Judah because they didn't believe in picking the Jews? They were an enslaved people. What are the chances that a Jewish orphan girl could be made queen out of a pool of thousands and thousands of women? That was God. That was God raising her up for such a time as this, as it says there in Esther 4:14. But I want to say to all of us here, there's something far more important than beauty. And that's God's favor. And as you look at chapter 2, as you begin to read chapter 2, you start seeing all of a sudden this word, she obtained favor. Esther obtained favor. Esther obtained grace and favor. She had favor. And every time you see the word favor mentioned 7 times, it's always associated with Esther. Esther had the favor of God. And even though people had beauty treatments of oil and myrrh and perfumes, it does nothing without the favor of the Lord. And that's what all of us need, right? We all need God's favor in our lives. That's what we need, is God's favor to be with us. We can't open any doors. We can't do this. We can't move forward. We can't even be promoted in any way in the things of the Lord without the favor of God. And that's what Esther had. She had God's favor, and she had God's power on her life. So when she was finally selected queen 4 years later, she was crowned there. We see that in verse 16 on the month of Tebeth, which is January, which was the 10th month, and it happened to be the 7th year of the king's reign. So they threw another feast there in verse 18, a great feast, and it was the feast of Esther this time because she was made to be the queen. Now, there is a question, a lot of people ask this. Was Esther, did she do this voluntarily? Or was she actually forced out? In this video on this movie on Esther, you see Mordecai trying to hide Esther. Because think about it. Think about what a harem meant. Think about all those girls. Let's say there were 400 girls that were the finalists. They each, one by one, had to go in, virgins, lose their virginity with this king. And if he wasn't happy with them, that was it for them until they were called again. And they stayed in the dorm, in these women houses, for the rest of their life. They could not go marry anybody else. They couldn't marry a husband. They couldn't have family, children. If they had any kids, they were taken from her and raised in a special school. So they were these concubines that it was just a terrible situation for them. Of course they were treated well. Of course they had all they wanted. But it was terrible just sitting around there fanning yourself and putting on makeup every day just in case the king called you. All to just have one night with him. What a terrible life that would have been, really. Some people may have liked it if they were poor or whatever, but what a terrible life. As one commentator called it, desolate seclusion. They're just there, and you're just a sex slave for the rest of your life for a heathen king. And as you got older, man, you were really out. And Chuck Swindoll says something here. Just stop and think. Why would a young Jewish girl want to get involved in a plan that would force her to leave the only family she had under the guardianship of one she respected and loved, Mordecai? Why would she want to spend a year shut away in a harem, culminating in a night with a heathen king that might result in the possibility of intermarriage outside of her race? No question, I think it's safe to say she went reluctantly. And yet, she went. And we see there in verse 16, and that's where a lot of commentators make this point, Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus. And that's kind of a strong language there. We don't know exactly, but it's possible that she went and she really didn't want to go. But she went and ended up fulfilling God's purposes. All right, let's close with these last verses here, verses 19 through 23. There's something about Mordecai that whenever I used to read the book of Esther, it always bugged me. It always bugged me because it looked like Mordecai didn't have a job. He was always sitting by the king's gate. And I always pictured him and go, man, why don't you get a job? Go work, go earn a living. Why are you always sitting there? You're worried about Esther and you're sitting by the king's gate? Well, as it turns out, that was an idiom, a way of saying that he was a judge who sat by the king's gate and he handled complaints and administered justice. That was his job. He was right there by the king's gate, and people would come to him. And that's what it says over and over again in chapter 2, verse 19. Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Mordecai the Jew who sat within the king's gate. Mordecai went back to the king's gate. So when Hathach went out to Mordecai in the square city, he was in front of the king's gate. That's where he worked. He was probably a judge who handled complaints and administered justice. So that was actually his place to be. And just think about it. He just happened to be located at the certain gate where these two guys are plotting the assassination of the king. Bigthana and Teresh are making this plot. He just by coincidence, just by chance, by luck, he happens to be at the gate where these two doorkeepers, who are eunuchs again, these doorkeepers are plotting to kill the king. And Mordecai hears what happens. And that was a huge thing, right? For what's coming years later, God already has it all set up. Later on, when the king can't sleep in chapter 6, years later, it's already written down that Mordecai discovered this plot and made it known. So, the other providence, as you read this, is whenever somebody does something like this, certainly this is huge. I mean, he exposes a plot. Notice what it says there in verse 23, the last words. It was written in the book of the Chronicles. And when did they write it and how did they write it? They wrote it right in the presence of the king. The king was there as they're writing down. Mordecai spared the king's life. He exposed this thing by Bigthana and Teresh. He made sure he reported it to Esther, and Esther reported it to the king. They found out that this was done, and it was all done by Mordecai. And right then and there, the king was supposed to honor Mordecai. That's what they always did. They honored them. They would give them special things. They wouldn't have taxes. They would promote them. They would put them somewhere in the kingdom as one of the satraps or something like that. And right in the very presence of the king does nothing. Oh, man. Why does he do that? And in fact, the very next verse, chapter 3, verse 1, who gets promoted? Haman gets promoted. Well, we know it's more than 4 years later that this happens, but nothing, no honor, no blessing, no gift, nothing. They didn't even hand him a pin or a watch. Nothing is given to Mordecai. You know why? Because the timing wasn't right yet. We needed other things to come into place so that later on, when the king has the sleepless night, they go pull the records, and that's when he gets honored. God made sure the king forgot. So this delay is working within God's perfect timing. And sometimes when we don't get the job, or we don't get honored, or we don't get this or that, maybe it just wasn't the right time. Maybe it's not what God has for us right then and there. So consequently, let's not worry about it. Leave it in God's hands. He knows, and He will honor you and lift you up, because promotion doesn't come from the east or the west or the south. It comes from God. It comes from the Lord. And also, you have to think about chapter 2, verse 10 and chapter 2, verse 20. Mordecai charged. He charged her. He commanded her, please don't reveal your identity. That's a very important part of the story. And she couldn't reveal her identity, or she would have been immediately disqualified from the Miss Persia contest. But consider this supernatural balancing act that Esther has to do to live as a Jewish queen in a pagan court. By birth, she's Jewish, but in life, she has to live as a Persian. Job says this, her Jewish character led her to obey Mordecai. You be obedient to your elders, to your fathers. But paradoxically, that meant she had to deny that character and live as a pagan. She couldn't let it be known that she worshiped Jehovah God. So how could she do that? How could she do that for those years where she was Hadassah, but she had to live as Esther in front of them? That took the power of God for her to reveal her as a Jew just at the right time. So there is a time to speak, and there's a time to be silent. And she knew how to do it. It was powerful. The last slide to summarize. So God removed one queen, and He raised up another. And that whole process started 9 years in advance of Haman ever showing up. And Esther is supernaturally selected from tens of thousands of beautiful ladies. And Baldwin says, Esther's choice as queen had been no random chance, but it was the work of the director of world affairs, so that through her, this act of deliverance could be effected. And Mordecai hears of an assassination plot and gets credit for exposing this evil deed, but his honor is delayed supernaturally for just the right time. And Esther remains silent until just the right time too. All these things are working together supernaturally to do what God wants done in Persia and with the Jewish people. Amen.